This episode, I'm joined once again by Tim Howles to discuss the work of William Golding. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible. And if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Tim Howles, thanks once again for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thanks, James. Great to be here.
We are going to be discussing the work of the novelist and writer William Golding, who the majority of people, I think, both in the UK curriculum, I'm not sure what years, but the UK curriculum and also think the US curriculum would be well aware of William Golding via usually one novel, which is Lord of the Flies, published in the early 50s. But we are primarily going to be discussing four of Golding's works. So Lord of the Flies is one of them, but also the Spire, Darkness Visible, and the Inheritors. That isn't, Golding's corpus spans far beyond that. I think there's probably about maybe 10 or so novels. It's quite a big oeuvre. His novels are, I would say, just before we get going, from these four, they are sort of suspiciously on the surface, seemingly simple. Sort of, if you were to quickly describe them, the Spire is this sort of maybe a retelling of the Tower of Babel. Darkness Visible is, and I'm sort of drawing off your own essay, which we'll get to, but a sort of a moral tale of good and evil. The Inheritors, I guess, is about power and language, and then Lord of the Flies, as many people will well know, is about maturity, childhood, innocence. And all of them, I think, are drawn together by threads of religion, Eden, what it is to grow, what it is to be fallen. But why I say suspiciously simple, because they seem like these very clear-cut, possibly Christian-influenced moral tales. But as you get into them, the complexity and Golding's ability as a writer just takes you down all these incredible avenues, especially with Spire, and sort of a hidden writer in that way, that even though Lord of the Flies is an incredible book, I will say, it's sort of a shame to think that maybe that's where people would stop with Golding, and think, oh, he's just one of these high school authors or something like that, which absolutely is not the case. So that's my own little introduction there to my thoughts on Golding. But Tim, how did you get in? Were you a Lord of the Flies curriculum person? Was that your first introduction to Golding?
I never encountered him in the curriculum, actually. So this is a hobby, something I've come to later on. And you're right, the Lord of the Flies is the entry point. And indeed, as you know, the biography about 12 years ago is entitled William Golding, the man who wrote Lord of the Flies. So there we have an invitation to explore deeper.
So why you've recently written this lengthy essay on Golding in relation to fable, specifically Darkness Visible in relation as a fabular tale or an allegorical tale. Why your recent sort of maybe your own renaissance of Golding interest?
I think, as you say, James, the writing is virtuosic, really, and we need to get into why this slightly strange, provincial, somewhat bucolic, perhaps, man was able to write with such sparkling, such a sheen to it, if you like. I also think he was writing in a contrary direction to many of the trends in the British novel from the 1950s onwards. So he's an outlier, and indeed there are no real Golding followers if such a thing could exist today. But also for me, I think he presages questions and themes in our contemporary society, themes to do with modernity, technology, religion, and the place of religion in a supposedly secular world, and especially for me, progress. What does it mean for human beings to make progress? Evolutionary progress in development of language, of social order, and so on. And he's going to turn around that question in a number of visual motifs and tropes and thematically throughout the novels. So I think he's a very relevant author for our contemporary moment here in 2024.
I like what you say about him, the bucolic. If you go look at an image of Golding and listen to him speak, he has a very Old English accent, lives in a very kind of twee house, and has a sort of very, dare I say, he actually reminds me of a priest that I know. It looks exactly like him with his imagery. But you wouldn't, in a way, not to sort of say, oh, such a person wouldn't write that, but the novel that is The Inheritors, you almost wouldn't expect it to come from such a man. So, biographically speaking, where are we situating ourselves here, Tim?
So Golding was born in Cornwall in 1911 and died in that same county in 1993. And I think when we look at his parents, we see something of a dichotomy that we can trace throughout his own thought. So his father, Alec, teacher at Marlborough Grammar School, an atheist, a scientific rationalist, an optimist, someone that believed in the progress of human Western society. And his mother, Mildred, an early politically engaged, early supporter of the suffragette movement, she was the one that would read him. We learn tales of mystery and wonder, and that would open his eyes to something a little bit more metaphysical in the world. And I think we're going to see a movement between those two poles throughout the work. So he moves off to Oxford in 1930 to study chemistry, but then transitions to English literature. Begins a career in a fairly bitty way with some part-time acting and stage managing. But I think two experiences that we can point to throughout his life are important. One is the Second World War, which he joined the Royal Navy, served on minesweepers, destroyers and cruisers, eventually became a lieutenant and commanded his own rocket launcher. And the war provides a background to many of his novels, Lord of the Flies, Pincher Martin, and Rites of Passage, for example. So here's a quote from Golding. "I must say that anyone who moves through these years without understanding that man produces evil as a bee produces honey must have been blind or sick in the head." So there's the war, and then there's also the experience of teaching, because Golding eventually moved into a teaching role at Bishop Wordsworth's School, a grammar school in Salisbury, from before and then after the war, where he taught English and classics. And he wrote several of the early novels whilst teaching, and that's important, I think. And so we then move into the books, beginning with Lord of the Flies, 1953, and there's a wonderful story there of its rejection by many publishing houses before it was eventually found in a so-called rejected or discarded pile by the Faber editor Charles Monteith, who became an important interlocutor really throughout his career. There's an early phase of novels that takes us from Lord of the Flies through to The Inheritors, 1955, Pincher Martin, 1956, Freefall, 1959, and then The Spire, 1964. And around 1962, he's giving up teaching and devoting himself to writing. So we enter that final independent writer phase of his life there. Continued to live in Salisbury for much of his married life, and that is important when we come to the motifs of the Spire, but moved back to Cornwall for the final years of his life. Booker Prize winner in 1980 and knighted in 1988. And I think some of his interests are present in his writing to a considerable degree. So he's a sailor, keen and adventurous sailor. He was an amateur archaeologist. Music and chess were important. And there was a great love of the classics, classical Greek literature in particular. And many critics have pointed out similarities in the structure of his novels or the form of his novels to Greek tragedy. And I think there's something there for sure.
It's also, I think, maybe there's something distinctly British as well. Obviously, he's a British author, but there's just something distinctly British. One thing just with the biography I want to throw in, because we have this sort of foundation, because I think it's so key. Does he believe in God? So he has Alec, his father is sort of rationalist, atheist. But does Golding, is he ever explicit about this?
Well, for me, he looks like a very typical mid to late 20th century disillusioned male, with one foot in a sort of Victorian Christian heritage, and its understanding of social and moral order and good conduct and so on, but with great struggles to believe in a personal or transcendent God. So here are a couple of quotes. "I believe in God, but God is not even that which I believe in." Or again, "I don't go to church, but I don't know that God does either." And I think we have this, but I think we can say we have echoes of a Christian or a theological anthropology and moral order threaded throughout the books, but that we'll see there are various mutations and distortions and even sort of bastardizations of that order that we'll encounter. And I think there's something about religion as part of that antinomy that we mentioned in his parents, reason and faith, science and the transcendent, etc. So this idea of two worlds and flashes of connection between them will be important, particularly for Dean Jocelyn in the Spire. And maybe just finally, I think there's a little something going on with the idea of the author. The author as God. As you know, James, we have all sorts of authorial displacements, unreliable narrators, and concerns about the hegemonic presence of a godlike author throughout the novels. In that sense, he's indexing with modernist or in the wake of modernist narratival themes, but he's doing something very subtle, and often those questions are keyed into ideas of God as the ultimate author, the ultimate viewer of human affairs.
I actually wanted to, there's a good segue, because the way I wanted to enter into the discussion of his novels is actually to talk about, and this was pointed out to me by one of I did briefly skim a couple of secondaries just to see, but there is so many, his novels are so rich thematically that there is no, I yet to find one sort of reading that was, the common reading. But one thing that was pointed out, and I thought actually that's fascinating that they've pulled that thread out, was how, as we're talking about entry into his novel, this author, the place of the author and what it is to have the perspective, how Golding begins his novels with not necessarily the literal beginning, but the beginning of the entry of characters into the worlds that he's set. And so Lord of the Flies, we have sort of out of the blue, this we're not really told about the plane crash. We discern that just from the situation. But the beginning of the Lord of the Flies is really this strange imagery of young children just sort of emerging from the woods or the forest. And they emerge quite naturally. And then, as you'll well know, with Darkness Visible, which I think is one of the strongest openings I've read in a book, is this horrendous, almost reverse abortion of life from the Blitz, from Matty, arising as some strange figure from the fire. And these are two sort of strange arrivals. And then with the Spire and with Inheritors, we almost don't have an arrival because everything is so intermeshed. The Inheritors, this group of Neanderthals, are, the way Golding quite brilliantly writes it, the language is one with the world. And then the Spire, as you mentioned, I'll have to admit, I restarted this book about 50 pages in because I was like, hang on a minute, am I just a really bad reader and completely confused? But Golding with the Spire, I mean, you are thrown into just a tumult of perspective and confusion that is written once you realize what he's doing spectacularly. So my question there is, Golding has a hesitancy to put his characters in the world in any simple way. And I think this maybe has something to do with them being fallen, this notion of evil, as you've mentioned. But that relationship between character and world is a strange one for Golding, and he's never fully comfortable with them just being there.
Well, they do enter in media res, as you say. I think you're quite right. Actually, I'm just looking at page 1, sentence 1 of the Spire that begins, "He was laughing, chin up, and shaking his head." And there's something rather wonderful about that past continuous there. He was doing something we're already entering. But what we enter into is confused. And often that's the function of the narratival posture. And I think what we find is a third person narrator that has pretensions to universality, as it were, in the great tradition, but is so very close to the protagonist that sometimes it's liminal. It spills over. The authorial voice sometimes spills over into the character. And I think Jocelyn in the Spire is a great example of that. I mean, as you know, we have here a strange tale of the construction of a spire on a medieval cathedral. The plot is quite simple. The dean of the cathedral pushes through the construction project with the workers who have been hired in the teeth of obstacles in the cathedral chapter, the city outside, and translates that into a great internal spiritual struggle. So Dean Jocelyn believes he and he alone has received a divine command that this spire should be constructed, and that he alone has the spiritual power to force that through. What we begin to see is that the damage he's causing to those around him, manipulations, co-options, he begins to deploy relationships in order to secure his ultimate aim. Golding was a great reader of detective fiction, and I think there is something about the detective novel here as well. We have to piece together clues to find out what on earth is going on as we read. And in some ways, the end of the novels present these sort of great unravelings and decipherings and revelations, but they too leave us confused. They don't resolve, but send us back to the beginning in this cycle to find out again what's really happened. So there's no truth to be found at the bottom of all that.
It's interesting you mentioned truth. So I was hesitant to do this because, as you said, there's the realism entering into modernism, but there's also, I do think, possibly even some postmodern aspects of Golding in this acknowledgement of that play between what's going on and how the author is describing it. Because in his works, there is what I would describe as a sort of strange animism where we're not really sure if he will just use the word angel or use the voice of suddenly the word is capitalized as whisper or light, and all of a sudden we're to question, hang on, there was something real that was happening here, and now all of a sudden he is thrown in, the angel spoke to Jocelyn as if it was entirely real, and so his sort of the world is alive in that sense. Who are we to really trust? And there's sort of I think there's a notion of order on the side. Order and chaos is a clear Golding theme, I think, of trying to hold everything together. So that on the side of the author, there is order. But one thing that stood out to me, I know we weren't going to draw on it too much, but Lord of the Flies, something that made me laugh is when we're first introduced, the author begins by describing who we come to know as Piggy as just the sort of plump young boy. And as soon as the plump young boy says to Ralph, "Oh, my friends used to call me Piggy," the next sentence, the author says, "And Piggy replied," right? So he suddenly is sort of on the side of that horrible power that takes over the island. And I thought it's quite, I'm sure Golding sort of completely realized what he was doing there, but I found it kind of humorous that he immediately goes, "Oh, well, guess we'll just accept and call him Piggy, and he gets drawn into that same abusive power that sends everything awry. But that always seems to be there as whoever this author is trying to hold everything together. And sometimes I think not necessarily failing, but being themselves flummoxed, especially when we get to the scenes in the Spire where, well, with the pit. I mean, that to me was just, well, you know, what is going on now? This is really, which I'm sure we'll get to. But yeah, order, chaos is Golding trying to hold the world together, do you think, as his position of the author?
He's possibly showing us the impossibility of doing that. Here's a little quote from a late essay of his as he reflects on the author's craft, if you like. This is an essay called Belief and Creativity. Quote, the writer watches the greatest mystery of all. It's the moment of most vital awareness, the moment of most passionate and unsupported conviction. It shines or cries. There is the writer trying to grab it as it passes, as it emerges impossibly and heads to be gone. It is that twist of behavior, that phrase, sentence, paragraph, that happening on which the writer would bet his whole fortune and stake his life as a true thing. Like God, he looks on his creation and knows what he has done. And I think there's a sense there in which Golding, who often would say he didn't really understand what he himself had written, is positing the author as a passive observer or receiver of an order that's already out there, an order that is found somewhere in the bridge between the rationalist, modernist, progress-driven worldview of his father and the sacred-infused, metaphysically alert worldview of his mother. But that God is elusive as an author, and the Spire is asking us that question, isn't it? Can we trust a man who believes he's been ordained by God to do something and cannot hear the voice of rationalism from any of his fellow protagonists, who pushes through that vision of the Spire to the great cost that it causes? And I think the proximity of the author to the character is not allowing us any way out. It's not giving us any authority position on which to make a judgment. Is this character a saint, or is he insane?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very, very difficult to decide which is which. And that's the genius of the writing, that it doesn't really allow you to come up one way or another. It forces you to consider that it could be either or both and.
Mm. But with regards to that, it's interesting that, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning, sort of simplicity of the tales as fables, as you emphasize in your essay, with, you know, if you're to bring in something such as nothing new under the sun, which is often happening in these stories. I mean, the notion of what will a set of children who are given, you know, a civilization in miniature do? Well, they will repeat civilization. What will the Tower of Babel again happen? Well, it will be the Tower of Babel once more. And then with Matty and Sophie in Darkness Visible, that's a little bit different, but there's sort of a determinism in their character where we're left to question whether or not, you know, I guess we should give the outline of the story. But Matty, this war-torn, well, we don't really know what exactly he is. This child that's born from the fires of the Blitz, as an analogy, is then, you know, it's really difficult to actually describe the plot, thinking on it now, because just this strange child that's been born from the war and the fires of the war, who is sort of bitter, and Golding describes as when he talks, he is giving birth to jagged eggs out of his mouth. A really caustic existence where one would have every sympathy if they were angry at life, has, once again, a calling from God, a very clear calling, an obedience, and eventually ends up as a sort of almost a Christ-like figure. But there's once again that notion of, well, is that simple obedience actually moral, or is it just following a call? And so, my question there, I guess, is what do you think it is that Golding is bringing in that somehow manages to refresh these fables, to refresh what are on the surface seemingly, I mean, maybe you disagree with me, but seemingly simple moral tales, because they feel completely new.
Yeah, well, one thing is that he's subverting the easy worldview of the Victorian or the pre-modern era. So in Lord of the Flies, the first novel, we have a bunch of boys landing on an island, but it's what we're told they're essentially, there's a group of choir boys. Jack is the chapel chorister and the head boy of the school. So there's this sort of Christian social order that's, as it were, expected. And as they begin to realize that there are no adult figures to compel that order, then society begins to be constructed in a different way. There's also an intertextuality here. Many of his novels are written in dialogue with, as an echo of, or a subversion of some previous text. And quite evidently, in the case of Lord of the Flies, we have a reference to the earlier Victorian romance adventure novel, The Coral Island, R.M. Ballantyne, published in 1858. And this was a similar tale of boys marooned on an island. But what we find there is a depiction of Victorian optimism. The boys organize themselves. They encounter, as it were, savages on the island, but Christianize them, educate them, and so on. There are echoes of that in this Lord of the Flies book. At one stage, Ralph says, quote, "We're not savages, we're English, and the English are best at everything." But these English schoolboys, of course, have evil inside them. And it's the recognition that society can't be ordered from the outside, because the evil that's inside will always overwhelm any order that's applied. In the case of Darkness Visible, we're moving to a very late novel there, 1979, and a very different sort of structure, because in one sense, this is a much more realistic novel. It seems to be set in contemporary Britain, late 70s, post-industrialized, somewhat deflated mood of the country in those years. And we have injected into that scenography this very strange character, Matty, who seems to adopt the postures and speak the language of a biblical prophet, and yet his behavior is odd. We don't seem to necessarily recognize it as good in a Christian moral sense. And I think, again, that novel's saying, what is goodness in this modern moment in which we find ourselves? What would it look like if a prophet or a saint was to enter our situation, walk the streets of London? Would we recognize him or her? How would their behavior appear? And I think the strangeness of Matty is forcing us to confront those questions. But I mean, it'd be interesting to hear as well your sense of the character of Matty from Darkness Visible. Was it an appealing character in any form?
Well, I think it's one of the greatest entries. I think I'm sort of repeating myself here, but it's one of the greatest entries of a character. This vision of Blitz firefighters looking upon some strange child emerging from the fires of bombing, and with an absolutely fearsome prose in the beginning. And actually, it reminds me, I mean, you mentioned how Golding spoke about the war and how people should look around and realize we're capable of evil. It reminds me exactly of both of our favorites, Michel Serres' quote of how the bombing of Nagasaki is seared into every page of his work. It seems very much the same here with Matti. Immediately for me came to be, okay, sort of, we are given, the idea of a child walking out of a fire is something, it's a responsibility. We now have to take responsibility for the consequences of these actions. And that responsibility will be strange. It will be kind of horrible. And Matti, no one wants to say that it's horrible to be around any child, but Matti is almost sort of a Lynchian figure, this sort of horrible, torn, half-mottled, horrible thing that you don't really want to spend time with at all. And that sort of, I think, for me, was the interest of the character is as a consequence of the modern world. Matti is literally the child of the modern world. And here you go, you've got to deal with him. And he's not nice, ultimately not nice to deal with, because Golding writes him in a sickly way. And I believe, if I'm remembering right, the nurses don't want, no one in the novel wants to, and the only reason he is dealt with is abusively for a teacher to get off the hook from other accusations. So the teacher, I can't remember the teacher's name, is being accused of always spending time with young boys, and he then chooses to spend time with Matti, the accusation being that he's a paedophile. But he chooses purposely to spend time with Matti because he is an ugly child that will somehow get him off the hook. So this whole birth of this character is one of a horrible birth of a modern child that is then just used and abused, basically. Yeah, that's my thoughts on Matti. But you do be the same. There is always some sympathy for him, because I don't think he had a choice. There's no choice in his. There's no in that way. There's no choice in this world. So I think there is some. I wouldn't say stoicism, but we'll get to that discussion of optimism or pessimism. I'm not sure if it's either with Matti. I think Golding's just giving us a consequence, and the morals come after. How do we deal with that? Yeah, sorry, I rambled a bit there.
Yes, and he's contrasted, as you know, with this character Sophie, a female character in the book, who is understood to be very beautiful and amenable, congenial to the male gaze throughout the book. So her face presents not as disfigured, but as beautiful, but her behavior is morally evil, and she's able to use that pleasant face, as it were, to move through life in order to carry out evil. Matti's disfigured face is the opportunity for the characters around him to move beyond the surface and to see a goodness that isn't superficial. And there's a commentary there on the superficiality of the gaze of the late 20th century modern person, for sure.
This brings in a question for me. What do you think is the importance of children for Golding? Because I wonder if for Golding, at least in a cultural sense, so to spoil the end of Lord of the Flies, this sort of, the one part of pessimism of Lord of the Flies is that eventually these children do get rescued, and a captain, admiral, I think it is, turns up on the island, and his response to see how they've devolved into this chaos and barbarism is one of really just complete disappointment. And yet, seeing that they've turned into basically warlike creatures, and yet there's this sort of pessimistic pun that he is judgmental of them as children, that they've happened to do this, and then he turns and he is commanding a warship, right? So there's that. And I wonder if Golding, there isn't really all that much difference between the maturation and life of a child and how the children of Lord of the Flies acted. Really, adults really act the same way, but we throw a few complexities on top to make it seem like we're a bit more mature. But not much seems to change between the two.
He turns up at the end, doesn't he, with this somewhat incredulous, well, he's there, Ralph is running, screaming wildly for his life, fire rages behind him on the island. as the hunters led by Jack try to smoke him out. And he falls on the beach, turns, lifts his arms up to plead desperately for his life, and instead encounters the white pressed flannel trousers of an admiral, who looks down with incredulity and says, "What are you boys up to here?" And suddenly the incredibly closed and intense world of the novel opens out, and we see that these are just children playing, although they're not playing. They've been murdering each other. So very often at the end of Golding novels, we have this abrupt change of scene that's brought in by some external factor. The captain says, "Jolly good show. I guess you've been larking around just like those boys on the Coral Island." So there's the intertextuality. He says, what I would have expected to see here was good social order. Instead, we've actually witnessed the evil in their hearts intrude. There is another adult intrusion, of course, in the novel Lord of the Flies, because halfway through, a dead parachutist drops onto the mountain at the center of the island, gets caught in trees in such a way that the wind blows his dead body backwards and forwards. And this becomes the motif of the beast that precipitates total social collapse of the island with the boys on the island. So Golding once said, "I knew the boys were desperate for a sign from the adult world, and I sent them a sign." So here comes the dead parachutist. That is mythologized, and their fears are externalized onto. I think externalization is an important thread as well through the novels.
And as you mentioned before we started recording, Golding has this reputation as sort of an early literary pessimist and misanthrope, and supposedly sees the worst of humanity in his novels, with this idea that you mentioned of the evil is within us, and the idea that we can solve things from without is really ultimately incorrect. But we both agreed before we started recording that it's not. We both disagree here that he's a pessimist in any sense. I mean, and take any one of his novels, and there are ultimately beacons of hope, beacons of reason, beacons of rationality, however limited that might be. And I think maybe that's the crux of what we might call the pessimism, is that any beacon of hope or any optimism or any reason is usually thwarted because evil and chaos always manages to take it over. But that's not to say it's not there. Ralph is still trying to build up civilization, and there are people who are trying to tell Dean Jocelyn that, look, this isn't a good idea consistently, and there are people who help others. And we haven't mentioned so much the inheritors. In the inheritors, there is a deep, deep love between these protagonists. And so, I don't. He's maybe just a realist. I'm not sure where you stand on the optimist-pessimist question.
And for me, there's something even grander than that. There's intimations of a re-enchantment of the world that we find throughout his novels. I think the final chapter of the Spire would be important to analyze there, chapter 12, which for me is the greatest chapter of writing in the English language. Here we find a dying Jocelyn, the thoughts of a dying man, minutes, hours away from his own death. And we find there at the end a highly ambiguous moment of transcendence, where he looks through the window of his chambers and sees what he thinks is a partition between two panes of glass strut in his blurred vision, but which turns out to be the physical form of the spire dividing a single pane of glass. And there's something there about a binocular vision, two panes of glass, that then seems to merge into one as his eyes manage to focus on the vertical shape of the spire. And to me, there's something of an apotheosis there. But at the same time, the chapter is framed by his dim awareness of his priest sitting with him in the room, inviting him to receive the last rites, to receive the host as a sign of faith. And 3 times Jocelyn, we are led to believe, refuses to receive the host. In other words, he refuses his assent. This is an important word in the novel, assent with a double S, and ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, the ascent upwards in the spire. He refuses his assent to that fundamental gesture of faith to receive the body of Christ as a dying man. And the host is only laid on his tongue after his death. So there's some very contradictory understandings of what this moment of transcendence is for Jocelyn. But interestingly, as he sees that spire, he describes it as a waterfall flowing upwards. And I think this leads us nicely to the text you mentioned, the Inheritors, that also has a waterfall at the heart of its narrative.
Well, I think the first thing to say about the Inheritors is it's some of the most remarkable writing I've ever come across, because ultimately what Golding, and I mean, it's a courageous feat for any writer to try and do this. What Golding, so the Inheritors is ultimately the story of, I guess, what we now call a group of Homo erectus, just the evolutionary iteration prior to Homo sapiens. Less intelligent, don't really have the vocalization, things like this, dealing with and slowly having the realization of these strange creatures that happen to be, guess what, human beings. And so dealing, Homo erectus dealing with the coming of Homo sapiens as this sort of strange creature that are arising. But with that, ultimately what Golding then has to do is to verbalize and articulate the world which can't literally be articulated by these Homo erectus, or these Neanderthals. And so has to develop this language that I would sort of hastily call language of immanence. It's completely of the world somehow. So at one and the same time, he is the author, he is the point of view of these Neanderthals, but because their experience is so absolutely immanent and of the world, there is almost, like, to be a little bit philosophical here, there is no Heideggerian separation. There is no, like, we are familiar and the world's over there. They just are one with the world. This language manages somehow to articulate this beauty and enchantment that they just organically have. And then as the novel progresses, we see, then once again, that notion of intrusion. But just following them in the early stages of the novel is just it's a delight. Their interactions with just everything becomes this unique, descriptive, wonder, basically.
And yet there are hints, aren't there, that they're curiously unfitted for survival. They are, yes, they're at one with the natural world. They seem to have a sort of nature god, a sense of God as continuous with creation and the giftedness of the world that they inhabit. They have proto-religious rituals. They certainly have this sympathy with their embedded situation in the world. But then we find out that they've had to flee. There's some memory of a fire, and they've fled where they previously lived in the summer months, presumably due to a forest fire that decimated their population. They encounter these new men, us, modern Homo sapiens, with a complete absence of tools for understanding. They're attacked by these new people and still don't fully understand what they're doing. And spoiler alert, towards the end of the novel, one of these beautiful characters, falls into the river, clutches a large log that's there in the water, and is carried over the waterfall, going downwards, if you like, in the evolutionary race. Meanwhile, the modern people, rapacious, uncouth, divided, atomized, at enmity with each other, greedy of property and things. They, at the end of the novel, move up the bank, access a lake that is at the top of the waterfall, and using primitive canoes and sailboats, move against the tide up through the lake and outwards to a new world. They are equipped, notwithstanding their repugnant character, if you like. They move forward into evolutionary life. And this is the great irony, that we are the inheritors. We do inherit the world that is here depicted as being inhabited so warmly and so sympathetically by the Neanderthal community. But they aren't destined to survive. And you might remember or recall, James, at the end, the perspective transitions again to that of the new people, the modern people sailing away. We've seen them thus far only as aggressors, aliens to the Neanderthal group. And we suddenly begin to see their world. And it turns out they've been afraid by the Neanderthal people, who they see as sort of tree ogres. They thought they were under attack, even though we knew that Loke and his companions were merely trying to approach and retrieve some of their members that have been killed and eaten along the way. And finally, we have this extraordinary character who is beginning to sort of ship the heft of a weapon. So this knife that he's going to use to take over leadership of the group, he's beginning to weave in an image of the Neanderthal form into the handle of the knife. Of course, they've taken this little Neanderthal baby with them. And the sense is that there is to be intermingling. You know, the destiny of modern man is not to have eradicated the Neanderthals, but to have consumed them, as it were, and grow. And we inherit what is lost, even as we destroy and consume it. So there's a really deep commentary on ideas of progress, of inheritance, of tradition, of what it means to move forward into the world.
There's also one of technology, as you mentioned, with the knife, the simple object, and we see that again in Lord of the Flies, right at the beginning, with the sort of mysterious scene of this object that is under, I think it's some vines and branches, and it's the conch, the seashell, which is then used to like almost the single piece of technology they have at that time, and used to not only gather all the other scattered boys from the woods to one place by blowing into it from the sound, but then eventually used as basically a tool of democracy, that when you hold on to the conch, you can speak, which I think this all falls down at one point as well. There's a scene where I think it's Piggy who says, well, hang on, I've got hold of the conch, and that's sort of the beginnings of the destruction of any order that they brought, was the point where, well, we just sort of made that up, so we'll just get rid of it. But there's an interesting idea there with just the smallest simple piece of technology suddenly beginning a new era of progress. But with each piece of technology, I think, I guess each of those is an encapsulation of, with the car comes the car crash, whether the knife comes cutting up of food and maybe, cutting down a tree and building a hut, but also comes the possibility to go dominate another culture. Same with the conch, easily become the leader. I'm not sure is there a technological angle to the Spire?
The Spire is a piece of technology, and of course these extraordinary workmen come in as pagans into the life of the Christian cathedral and its community. I agree certainly with the motif, the image, which is so resonant still in popular culture. I remember when the Trump-Biden presidential debates were taking place in the last round in 2020, and there was that catastrophic debate where Trump was disorderly and spoke over everybody. And I remember a report at the time saying Trump was a conch breaker. In other words, he wasn't prepared to abide by the format of civilized debate. And that's exactly taken from Lord of the Flies. But yes, I think you're right, James. In this sense, I see Golding as a much more sort of continental novelist than an English one. His reality for him is born out of swirling mass of mixed motives of we build on compromised foundations in all sorts of ways. He's much more the inheritor of a sort of, tradition, a sort of almost like a Bergson tradition of retrieved memories and non-identical repetitions, much more than a sort of English empirical Lockean type worldview for me. And I think in a sense, the lesson I take from Golding is the ability to dwell in the midst of that confusion, not to seek for linearity and cause and effect. Even where cause and effect is to be found, it will have been built on some earlier harm, some earlier abduction or crime. And he's, for me, the ultimate author of messiness. He invites us to see moments of enchantment and beauty in the midst of the fundamental messiness of the world. So rather than a misanthropic or negative anthropology, I would use terms like messiness, confusion, circularity. And there's something of a synthesis. And I think that moment we talked about earlier at the end of the Spire, the binocular vision suddenly coming into play on a single point, is a moment of enchantment in the midst of so much that's confusing. Even the doctrines of the Christian faith are confused at that time for Jocelyn. But there's a flash and lots of moments of flashing throughout his novels. A kingfisher flashes through the scene, or a boy flashes out of a fire in darkness visible. Or ice glints in the Inheritors. So I read him in that sense, and I think he's therefore highly amenable to our, modern condition, where absolute truths are understood as both hard to retrieve and dangerous when they're found. And does plot a joyful, beautiful, empathetic worldview in the midst of that situation.
Well, you mentioned I was reluctant to call it messy, but now as you've used the word, I will use it because the Spire that's why I had to restart, because it is messy, but it's a testament to Golding's ability as a writer that when you get about halfway through and realize what's going on with all these perspectives and characters and points of view, the fact he's managed to hold this together in an exemplary fashion while heading in a direction is astounding. There is, just going back to that pessimist-optimist question, there is this, once again, a question of the author and the reader again. There is this position of when you see all of these characters from above, and even with something like Lord of the Flies as well, there is at times this notion of, most of these people did the best they could with the experiences they had. So Dean Jocelyn, as ultimately, as you said, saint or madman, he can be forgiven in walking that tightrope because at one and the same time, well, this is the experiences he has. Is it just a blazing pain in his spine and that is sending him crazy, or is it a message from the devil, a man in his position? And there's almost a case of what else could have been done. Perhaps, this is, as you say, it's, you mentioned Bergson. I mean, it's sort of, the novels feel at times like Lucretius, like something has spiraled out, and now we get to see the chaos of this event, and then it reins in. But this will never stop. There might be once again, Sarah as well. There might be a bit of and there is these moments of stability, and then they fall apart. And then there's another moment of stability, and then they fall apart. And I think so. It's optimist and pessimist, and when it is optimist, we get to enjoy that stability and order while it's there, and then carry on our way. Maybe that's pessimist in general.
These displaced equilibria that then reform somewhere else on the topological plane. Yes, and the angel motif is absolutely crucial there, isn't it? Because, of course, in chapter 1, as the pressures of construction begin to intrude on Jocelyn's consciousness, he kneels to pray and feels the warming presence at his back that he discerns to be an angel of encouragement and blessing. He alone is receiving God's mandate to do whatever it takes to force this spire upwards. And there's this, you could track it in the most wonderful way through the novel as he begins to doubt the sincerity of his own angel. The angel begins to speak to him at moments where we can discern that he's making a wrong decision. He makes a decision to sacrifice the well-being of another character in order to keep the workman on site. And there again, his angel comes to warm him. But we begin to see around this narrator, and we begin to doubt the motives of this angel. We then begin to find the angel described as having dark wings and so on. And the angel is beginning to morph into a satanic presence. And by the end, this angel is coming in dreams with a whip to torment him and so on. So we find out eventually that he has a wasting sort of a tuberculosis of the spine, and the warmth at his back was nothing other than physiological situation. Or was it? Perhaps it was God's ministering angel to him, because at the end of the novel, the spire still stands, even though there were no foundations.
Well, it stands with much trepidation as to the future. Have you personally made a decision as to Saint or Madman? Was he Jocelyn right in his quest?
The spire stands. Metatextual sense, the spire still stands today, because the novel is, it seems, based on the construction of Salisbury Cathedral spire, which also seemed to have inadequate foundations. But there's no way of answering that question, because Jocelyn's own moment of transcendence is based around an understanding of the crimes he's committed, the hurt he's caused, and that people matter more than the blind faith he put in the erection of this spire. However, I do think that 12th chapter of the book is worth, attention. It's a most stunning depiction of a dying man reconciling with the evils he's caused, but not yet giving up hope for the future. That's how I read it.
Okay. Well, considering, you with your own essay, you wrote about it as fables and moral tales, do you think, it's kind of a simplistic question, do you think Golding has morals that he would like us to attend to or learn in the modern world, or is the moral that those binary moralities really have maybe come to pass?
I think he invites us to analyze critically where and on what foundational moral order is based. And the moment something begins to take over as hegemonic, where we begin to lose connection with other people and with the natural world, because Golding is very much a nature writer as well, then, as it were, it becomes amoral or immoral. So there is no fixity. There's no single path that you can track through life. And actually freedom, and maybe even religion, for Golding, is to be found in resisting that sort of linearity, that sort of certainty, and in being agile to circumstances, alert to flashes of joy and meaningfulness in a muddled, difficult and confused world. And that's why I think he's a great writer for our times.
Where would you advise people to begin with his work?
I think it's wonderful to start with the Inheritors and the Spire, which are possibly the absolute great novels. Darkness Visible is a more tricky read, but very, very important, and actually offers a different form. It has a triadic form to it, which I think is very important, because we have there for the first time ideas of synthetic resolution in the form of the novel itself. And there is something for me of a resolution of Golding's metaphysical vision in that novel. But I would also encourage people to look into novels we haven't had a chance to discuss today. Close to my favorite is the 1956 novel Pincher Martin. That's from the early phase. I'm very, very fond of the late and posthumously published novel The Double Tongue, 1994. I think that's an absolutely wonderful piece of writing. That was the version we have is actually the first draft. Golding's compositional process very confused and difficult as well. So we have there, as it were, pure Golding. The novel was unfinished at his death. And finally, a very, very beautiful short story that I think is one of the great pieces of short story writing, about a sacristan in a church, a sort of English parish church, that destroys the life of a humble parishioner who sits in the chancel of the building, offering adoration to the reserved sacrament, the body of Christ reserved in the tabernacle at the front of the church. And she plays a trick on that character that leads to his demise. And again, that short story explores questions of faith, of the transcendent entering into the immanent, and what it means to actually sort of over-rationalize and therefore destroy the mystery of the world through one's own actions. There's so much to be found there.
And then, as you mentioned, the sort of the go-to biography is the John Kerry one that we mentioned, the man who wrote Lord of the Flies. I believe there's been quite a few others though. Where is your own article published? Or
well, I've written just a little article on the novel Darkness Visible to tease out some of the metaphysical implications of that novel, as we discussed, and that should be out in the journal Essays in Criticism later this year, around September, I think.
Okay. What are you working? What else are you working on at the moment?
Well, I'm carrying on with my work on René Latour, Michel Serres. I'm increasingly working on the thought of James Lovelock as well. So just tying in some of these Gaian thematics with contemporary political ecology, that sort of thing.
All right. Is there anything you'd like to add about our discussion of Golding?
There's so much more to be said, and I think we wanted this to be just an introduction, but especially, as you say, that sense of reappropriating Golding as a author of transcendence, enchantment, and hopefulness for the modern world. And I think if we can just send off our listeners with that ringing in their ears, we would have done a good job.
There you go. I think it's a good place to finish up. Tim Howles, once again, thanks very much.
Thank you, James.